Oh boy.
Aunt
It's
Thomas
a,
is here.
Alright, so are we live? Is that going on?
we are live, but I think did we do it? Nope, it created a new one.
I don't understand what I'm supposed to do in order to be able to get it to go onto the ones we schedule.
What the hell am I hearing?
You are hearing dogs whining in the background, it sounds like. Alright, so we're gonna have to.
All right. Well, we have one viewer here, so
Okay.
yes, you are live. It says, "All right, cool."
Alright, sweet. Hello, some
We
random
have
geek. We're sorry about that. We're trying to figure out how to get OBS to sync up with scheduled streams on YouTube, and it has given us some trouble. So, I guess, Calon, do you want to do the introduction, or do you want to have me do it since it's my topic?
Well, first we're going to introduce ourselves.
I know.
I'm Calon. This is our new co-host, Aliakai. And well, I'll let her introduce the topic.
Now I'm good, I think.
We are actually live right now, Thomas.
Oh.
So, hi guys. I was actually here last week with Via, who's got that lovely turtle up there in the corner. But I was kind of the one that came up with this topic. We did a dual stream with Nokasuchi, where on his channel we talked a lot about, like, Callan and I talked a lot about how the Christian church sort of shuts down free thought. So here on Poly-Ology, we're going to go a little deeper into that and talk about how the Bible and the Christian church itself actually sort of distances us from God if you're a follower, and how that can cause problems after you deconvert if you end up getting called by one of the pagan gods, how difficult having that sort of like tumultuous, almost Stockholmy type relationship can be, and how like the hegemonic sort of pressure that God is distant can ultimately hurt when you're interacting with gods that are not. So there are two other folks that need to introduce themselves, but that's the topic for today.
Are we actually live?
We are live, as I said.
Very cool.
So Thomas, Via, you guys haven't introduced yourselves yet.
Yeah,
Hey,
hi, I'm Vita.
Oh.
Go ahead.
I'm Thomas. I'm a Hellenic polytheist. So, yeah.
I'm Via, and I have a turtle. That's all you need to know.
That's all anyone needs to know really about you.
Via's
Every other part of your identity.
Via's having a little bit of mic issues at the moment, so apologies, guys.
Wait, it still says we're waiting.
That's because it didn't latch onto the scheduled stream for some reason. I can't get it to.
Oh, okay.
So we're in a different stream window.
Yeah.
So, who would like to start the discussion? Because I know that we all have stories to some degree or another of experiencing this.
I think you should actually, because well, I was never. I think someone who has familiarity with Christianity needs to start it because I was never Christian.
Okay. Well, one of the big things that I have a issue with in the Bible, and that kind of ultimately led to my deconversion, which I'll be talking about a little bit later, is that the Bible constantly talks about how dirty and disgusting and sinful and all these other things humans are. There's this constant refrain of, well, humans are dirty and nasty and disgusting and original sin, particularly women, oh, the sins of Eve, versus, well, God loves you and wants a relationship with you, and that salvation might come through some sort of relationship with Jesus, who might also be God, and it might come through works according to a different section of the Bible. And it also might come through baptism. That might be required, but it might not. And so you end up with this position where you have this God that you're told basically hates you. That as you go through the Bible, which we mentioned on Nokasuchi's channel, as you go through the Bible, he gets less and less active. Like at the beginning, he's active with every human being on Earth. Like that's Genesis, right? Then you get to Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, and he's really only active with a couple of people, like mostly with like Moses and with his brother. And then later on, you get, oh, well, God talks to a number of different prophets. God talks directly to a number of different, like, people in the church in general, like kings and other things. And then by the time you get to Jesus, like, you don't get God directly talking to Jesus at all. You kind of just get Jesus supposed to be is God. He's God's son, I guess. So, like, maybe he's talking to people
But he's
through
God
Jesus.
himself.
But he's also God himself. The Trinity is a problem, and Ocean covered that better than we can. And then when
Yeah.
you get to the letters, like you get past the four Gospels and you get to the letters, now you've just got Paul is talking, and he says he has a vision, but now you've just got Paul talking to the church, and God's kind of gone. And when you have a church that then says, well, the Bible is the beginning and end of everything you could possibly know about Christianity, he's the beginning of end of everything, like every experience has to be validated by the Bible or through the church, depending on what church you're from, then things like, you know, the gifts of the Spirit, which were heavily directly defined in the Bible, you get things like visions and stuff that pagans talk about validating our experiences. You know, UPG.
And that's validating our theology.
Yes, those things are actually discouraged heavily in the church. Like, you can say, oh, well, I prayed and God gave me money or something like that, but if you have a vision and you're like, God told me to do this for him, you're insane. Like, the church is going to shut you down for that. Unless, you know, you're, say, a Mormon or certain other denominations that believe in prophets, but even then, the church has to determine who God said is the prophet. The church is the ultimate arbiter of these things. So...
yeah, the church is somehow able to magically deem who has a spiritual experience and who doesn't, and everyone else is crazy.
So what can end up happening, like in my view, in my theory, is that you end up with this sort of, as talking to Calon about it, I described it as like a Stockholm syndrome.
Yeah.
God hates you. God hates you, and you are evil. And only through the church or through, again, the goalpost shifts constantly depending on what part of the Bible you're going to. So what you think saves you depends on your denomination. Like, do you think you're saved through works? Do you, you know, at per soul winning, like in Jehovah's Witnesses or Baptists? Do you think you're saved through baptism and that you get forgiven for everything? Do you think you're saved through penance and atonement, a la Catholicism? Like, you know, depending on which denomination you have, your relationship to God is blocked. You can either have a relationship with Jesus / the Holy Spirit, and like that means that you can have this indirect thing where like you're constantly begging for forgiveness, but you don't expect anything to like reply. But if you have any sort of direct experience, you're gonna be shut down. And that, I think, causes a lot of pain in people who leave the religion.
Right, because they teach you not to even trust your own senses, so to speak.
Yeah, you can't trust your own experiences at all.
Experience. And... Go on, Thomas?
I would just like to say that this possibly goes even before Christianity. There's an incident in the Old Testament or the Tanakh known as the incident of the golden calf, and the incident involves, involves the Israelites banding together to worship a supposed representation of God, which is this golden statue of a calf, and when Moses saw this, he was infuriated that they would have a supposed personal connection with him, and then he ended up slaughtering all of the people who were worshiping the golden calf.
Wasn't the golden calf, Calon, I think we talked about this in Naka stream, wasn't the golden calf also a representation of a Canaanite deity as well?
Yes. Mm-hmm. The golden calf, it would have been a representation most likely of El. El was represented as the golden bull and was called like the bull of heaven. He was perceived as being above all the other Canaanite gods in the Ugaritic text. So anything that sort of happened in like the court of El, for example, and his children were called the Elohim.
Which are actually
From
referenced, the Elohim are referenced multiple times in one of the accounts in Genesis of the creation. Um,
Indeed,
if I
but
remember
Allah is
right,
actually his son.
yeah, if I was saying, if I remember right, that I hope that, I wish Chris was here to correct me, biblical history skeptic, but if I remember right, the first account of the creation refers to the Elohim, but the second account of the creation of the
Elohim, actually,
garden,
that is what. Mm-hmm.
only references Yahweh.
Yeah. So there's that whole. Yeah.
And am I
Mm-hmm.
correct in saying that Elohim is distinctly plural
Elohim.
in is it distinctly plural in Hebrew?
Uh,
Yes,
well, according to
it is
Chris,
plural, but it could
sometimes.
also be a. Okay, so here's the thing with plurals. It could also sometimes when you want to emphasize like how great something is, you'll use the plural. So you get what we would in English call the royal we,
I see.
and that makes something greater, and it's a kind of a form of honorific. And so sometimes in Hebrew, from what I recall, you get that.
Yeah. So that actually brings me to an interesting point, Thomas, because I've been meaning to bring this up. I think part of the reason why the sacrifice of Jesus is so very heavily, like, almost fetishized in the Christian religion is because of the fact that Jesus's image, even though Jesus is part of the Trinity, it's not considered to be an image of God because he had a mortal body. So this is sort of a stopgap to this idea that you can't ever worship an image of God. And so people praying at the foot of, say, a statue of Jesus or Mary or something, Catholics mostly with Mary, like that is something you're actually allowed to do because you're supposed to, pray through Jesus. Nobody can have a relationship with the Father but through me, which again is yet another distancing tactic.
Mm-hmm.
Although, except the strange thing is that they will come back and say it's not a distancing tactic since Jesus is the Father. Well, since Jesus is God.
Although in later, most notably
But
Protestant denominations, they go against all forms of so-called idolatry. So, and that was one of the main reasons for the Protestant Reformation. As what I've read, and yeah.
Yeah, but I've been to
Well,
very few churches that.
it was that along with how the leaders in the church had too much power over the people,
Yeah.
and how someone would have to go to a priest or the Pope to have direct contact with God.
Yeah.
Oh, responding to the chat really quick, yes, Solomon did refer to it as Sophia, which was a goddess of wisdom. And I've also seen interesting things about the Gnostics and the concept of the Holy Spirit being female, or the concept of the feminine part of
yes,
God, the Shekinah.
yes, the feminine emanation of the monad
Yes.
is how they would refer probably to it from
Although
what I
I'm
recall from reading the Apocryphon of John.
although I guess that it probably wouldn't have actually been referred to as Sophia because that's Greek, and Solomon was thousands of years before the Greeks.
Yeah, I think that the Solomon reference, they do refer to wisdom with a proper name. I do believe they
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And that was kind of the point that was being made.
Mhm.
But so I would like to open up the floor a little bit to talk a bit about kind of your guys' personal experiences. I know Calon has had more experience with sort of hegemony and that distancing relationship than with latent Christianity, which in a little bit when we start talking about latent Christianity, I'll link to Ocean's video on the topic because I think he did a really good job talking about some of the ways that Christianity and having previously been Christian can mess with your relationship with the gods as a polytheist.
Mhm.
But like Thomas and Via, you guys said that you were both Christian before.
Yeah.
So
Not very much. I'd say I grew up in a pretty liberal Presbyterian household, and it wasn't really a thing that was that big of a presence in my life. I'd never felt burdened by any sort of authority, and I stopped going to church when I was rather young, so I don't really have that great of experiences to talk about this.
But I mean, like, have you ever had that idea of not being able to directly connect with the gods that came from Christianity kind of affect you as you've been trying to pursue a relationship with them now? I mean, I know that you kind of lean Platonist because of some of the organizational contact that you've had, but
Well, and also that I've read a fair bit of Plato and Plotinus and Proclus. So, but anyway, I honestly I'm not sure if I have, but I really do have an issue with sort of latent Christianity, just sort of coloring and corrupting sort of my perceptions on how to approach things. Like I'm always concerned that I don't know if this is real or just my anxiety talking, but I often wonder if whatever I'm doing is the right way to approach the gods, because we're also used to the idea of a singular dogma in whatever religious denomination we're in.
yeah,
Right.
I
The
mean,
idea being that
go on, Calon.
that with that there's a certain distance that you create by doing improper by not having one sort of practice as a sort of reference point, whereas with like proper practice within your own tradition, that doesn't that connects you to the gods in a way that sort of they get to determine how if they want to interact with you or not.
Well, and I mean, I know that Platonism says like we cannot like move the gods. The gods are unmoved by us, but that we can benefit by having contact with them. But there are a number of Platonist scholars, Edward Butler included, that would state that when we open ourselves up to deity, which I'm not a Platonist personally, I'm closer to being a Stoic. But when we open ourselves up to deity, we can still have personal experiences with them, and that the god would have a hand in that. You know, that they do get to consent whether or not they want to have these, you know, whether they want us to have these experiences with their presence or not. That just because they are unmoved by us doesn't necessarily mean that we can't have personal experiences with them.
Yeah, this was something that I was aware of when reading Plato, because this is sort of going a little bit off topic, but this is still within the same idea that how could any of the gods basically shapeshift into the forms of humans, like what Athena did very much in the Odyssey, because if they would change, then that means either changing into something that's better or worse. And if the gods are the best, are the greatest things there are, then it would only mean changing into something worse, which is not something that the gods could do. But anyway, this is not really pertinent to the topic at hand, but yeah, I think the late Platonist author Porphyry explained it rather well, that we venerate the gods primarily, and that we shouldn't necessarily ask for various things.
Hey, Sassy's in the chat.
Hey, Sassy.
Yeah, and I mean, like, we can have a debate on Hellenist philosophy, because, again, I'm not a Platonist personally, and part of my reason for that, as I detailed in the birthday stream for Naka yesterday, is because I feel like Aristotle does a really good job of dunking on the forms at the beginning of Nicomachean Ethics, and he kind of takes aim at them frequently, and his arguments make sense, and they're kind of core to Platonist philosophy. So for me, being a Neoplatonist isn't necessarily something, I'm still getting educated on it, but it's not something I consider myself right now.
if you want to look more into sort of Platonist critiques of the forms, I highly recommend reading at least the first section of Plato's Parmenides, because Parmenides, who is the main interlocutor, basically destroys young Socrates' notion that there has to be forms of literally everything.
Mm-hmm.
So, but again, that's not pertinent to the specific.
So, so to get back on topic, I can express some of my experiences. Like, for example, the surprise that I seem to get when I tell Christians, yes, I've met some of the gods. I've dealt with some of the gods. They're like, really? And it's like this idea that somehow the gods are not immanent is just totally foreign to them. Like,
and how would you define eminence for people who don't really understand what that word means?
immanence is the idea that the gods are interact with this world. They come into this plane whenever they will, or they are part of this plane, and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and a good chunk of polytheists, we have personal experience with the gods, so that's a good chunk of why we believe in them. You know, that's a big part of the philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's argument from experience. So to me, dealing with gods is not particularly something. I mean, it's a great experience and all, but it's not what I would call a rare experience. Whereas with Christians, they have all this gatekeeping that they can't simply stop and let themselves see what's right in front of their face, so to speak, in terms of religious experience.
Yeah, and so I think part of the struggle with that is when you have a religious experience as a pagan, it can be very difficult to sort of quantify and process that. There's this urge to try to disprove yourself. And I mean, we've been chatting a lot on Twitter with atheist folks who don't believe that, deity exists whatsoever, who would reinterpret that in terms of naturalism and materialism, like, oh, well, your brain just had a firing and that's what it was, or you had a hallucination or it's mental illness. But I mean, again, Butler sort of talks a lot about this as well, and I agree with him. He says that if an experience involved a deity, even if it was brought on by something like drugs, even if it was brought on by, say, schizophrenic hallucinations, it very likely is that the deity had something to do with the experience, but your ability to interpret it would then be compromised because of the nature of how it got brought about. So what you believe it means may be very different than what God intended, if you want to give, attributions to intent. But there is still a good chance that it has something to do with deity.
All the time with, right, we see this with, especially with Christians who think that they get to use their unverified personal gnosis, or for those Christians that do have experience, like say Pentecostals or the various other sects which have a bit more emphasis on the Holy Spirit, they think that they're UPG because of Christian hegemony, just then going out and telling us that, oh, our experiences are fake.
Well, and there's we kind of talked about this earlier when we were in a call, like, trying to get set up for the stream, but there's also this tendency in Christian circles to reclassify pagan experiences as, I've heard one of three things. The first is the appeal to materialism, which is very strange coming from a Christian. By the way, Calon, your mic is screwing up and the chat pointed it out. I didn't know if that was just on my end. But you were roboting a bit. But so the first is that appeal to materialism that you kind of get from, like, oh, well, you must have been hallucinating, it can't be real because they're just idols. And I've had some Christians have a hard time defining what idols are to me. Like, are they actually gods? They're just less than Yahweh? Are they just images and I'm hallucinating? Like, what is that? And a lot of people seem to have difficulty. The second is they say, oh, well, those gods might be real, but they're less than Yahweh, and they're more like spirits or demons. sort of infantilizing and reclassifying our experiences within that context. And the third is sort of a shrug, and that is, well, maybe it's actually Yahweh that's giving you that experience, but you're reinterpreting it as your God when he's actually trying to reach out to you. And that's kind of the kindest interpretation, but most of the time I get it's demons or Satan that are actually doing that, and that they're doing that to trick me, and that there's no way for me to know the difference.
And this goes into sort of the general problem with monotheism, that that if anyone has an experience with the deity that is not the so-called one true God, then it's exactly that. It's either demons or just a relabeling of an experience with the one true God, which is very much not the case from various religious experiences that people have had.
So, Via, I'm actually curious if you've had dealt with any of that on your end, like if you've ever had a religious experience discounted, or if you've struggled with acknowledging your experiences since you became a pagan.
I haven't had as much of a problem with experiences being discounted, but when I was still in the church, I definitely got a lot of that distancing from God with saying that I'm a filthy sinner. And there's really a lot of that shame built in, especially
Via,
for Lutheran.
Can you get closer to your mic or something? You're roboting a little bit, but when you get louder, it's clearer.
Yeah, so I've gotten a lot of the dirty sinner talk and shaming from being a Lutheran, because they have it especially bad, especially in their services, where lots of it is chanting stuff like, we admit that we are broken and hopeless without you, Lord, and stuff like that.
It feels like it's kind of trying to engender dependency, doesn't it? Like you can't have real self-confidence if your worldview is that you're disgusting.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yahweh is your strength. That is, he's your self-confidence.
Yeah, Calon, you're still having some problems with roboting. Are you on Wi-Fi or something?
Probably, yes.
Okay, you might want to try to get closer to your Wi-Fi side or something, because you're going in and out and being robot-y. You came clear through just then.
I did?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm clear now?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, cool.
So I guess kind of coming back to the whole relabeling everything as demonic, like, how do you think it would be best to respond to that? And have you ever had anxieties that your experiences actually were demonic, like that you were being led away from the path? Have you ever had that separation anxiety about hell or anything else? Has that ever interfered? I know Calon hasn't had that experience because Calon never was Christian, but Thomas, Via, have you guys ever had that panic? Because I did early on in my polytheist journey.
Not really, because I was atheist and then agnostic for many years before going into polytheism, so it's not that. So I never had that happen to me.
What about you, Via?
So for me, I haven't really had the issue of with it affecting my relationship with the gods. I've never really gotten that anxiety from it, but I definitely have been told a lot that my experiences with the gods have just been demons. That's actually one of the most common ones that I get. And what I find most effective for combating that is kind of getting to the root of why they think that my gods are demons. And usually it'll get into a circular argument about the Bible being true because God says it's true in the Bible.
Yeah, that's not a fun argument to get into. I mean, it can be because like it can be if the person is any sort of philosophically inclined, because ultimately, like, you can kind of deconstruct that, well, it comes back to faith thing, which it's fine if you admit that it comes back to faith, but if you're like, the Bible is true because the Bible says it's true, I mean, you're in a circular argument at that point. Like, and you have to
Yeah.
admit that in order
Yeah.
to proceed.
The way
That's usually what I get.
the way I approach those arguments is like the way that Ocean says a lot about debating people. The point isn't to convince the other person, it's to get them to say something so stupid that you don't have to reply. And that's kind of what I try to do by getting them into that circular argument, because if anyone else is watching, then there's a higher chance that they'll see that it's stupid and not worth responding to, especially if I don't respond to it.
Hmm. Yeah, for me, the way to go with relating is to ask them what classifies as a demon, and when they say it's anything that is Yahweh, say, how do you know that? And they point to the Bible and start going into that circular argument. At that point, they're just using unverified personal gnosis and trying to push that onto me. And that's what I point out, and usually that ends the conversation.
Calon, like, your mic's doing that again.
Great.
Yeah, I can't tell most of what you were just saying.
Okay, so can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're clear now.
Yeah.
All right, so what I was saying is that usually with that argument, it basically hinges upon the fact that they're just doing it off the fly by tradition, because that's how their family and that's how they were brought up, or two, they're trying to push some sort of unverified personal gnosis on you.
Mm-hmm.
And usually when I go with the latter, that tends to end the conversation quite quickly.
So, to answer Sassy, we're actually using OBS Streamlabs. The only reason that you guys saw my mouse just there was because I had to mute my mic to readjust myself, so I'm sorry about that. So, yeah, I mean, I've gotten into enough debates, mostly with atheists, actually. A lot of Christians don't try to debate you, they mostly try to convert you. So a discussion can be quite difficult. You occasionally get conversionist atheists, but I've noticed that there are
only run into those atheists.
Yeah, you're kind of a magnet for that stuff on Twitter a little bit, Calon. But like,
I mean, the provocative tweets don't help, I'm sure.
What?
You have this habit of like tweeting something out, making like statements about anti-theists, and that definitely draws a lot of them to you.
It's not my fault that they're wrong.
well, and
yeah, I'm not saying it's a bad thing that you do it. I'm just saying that that's the reason that they all come at you.
Well, and I mean, like, as far as them being wrong, like, whether you believe the gods exist or not, you're wrong that it's irrational to believe they do. And that's where I will get into debates and where I will get into arguments with people. I guess coming back to sort of the arguments for naturalism, though, I'm curious what you guys think of the view that, you know, whether the gods directly caused the interaction or not, that if... Okay, I'm going to reword this. That if you have a thing that is brought on by an additional condition, say schizophrenia, say something like hallucinogens, etc., you know, hallucinogens are used a lot in Native American practice, so that's one of the reasons I'm bringing them up here, that chances are, if it involves a deity, your ability to interpret it properly may be affected, but that the deity most likely does have something to do with it.
I say that it's a valid way up for gnosis. I mean, granted, you would also want verification by tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if, for example, if I hallucinate that...
do we want to take a quick break to go over UpG, SPG, and VPG, like, for the audience?
Yeah, that
Sure,
would probably
go run through it quickly.
Okay, so UpG is unverified personal gnosis. This is a personal experience that you have with deity or a revelation that you have about deity. So it could be something as like complex and intense as, say, a vision that you've had of the deity saying something or doing something, or it could be something as like small and minute as, say, you know, reading through a self-help book and finding a particular line that then you feel like this is a message to you from that deity. So then you have shared personal gnosis, which is SPG. This is when you have this experience with more than one person. So Calon and I were actually in a chat on Ocean server where there was a shared personal gnosis involving somebody getting called to the favor of Hermes. And like there were multiple people there who were witness to it, and all of us agreed that it was definitely the deity being involved with what specifically was going on, and it lasted for a number of hours. So
Yeah, I love hearing about that story every single time.
like that story is very fun. To protect the identity of everybody involved, since we haven't gotten permission to share it, I'm not going to, but I will just put it there that it was a fantastic experience, and it was hilarious for those of us who weren't being targeted by the god, and it, like a eye-opening experience for the person who was. So in terms of VPG, so that's verified personal gnosis, that's when some like either scholarly or like antiquity, like you find something in mythology or something else that then verifies that experience. So for me, in that same discussion, I had a vision involving Athena, like that drew me to Hellenic polytheism a long time ago, a few years back. And I talked about the vision because we were sharing personal experiences while this craziness was going on with Hermes. And somebody in the chat at the time started like posting pictures of armor, because I said her armor looked different in the vision than it did in any of the statues I'd ever seen her in, because she's usually not even portrayed with armor. She's usually portrayed in traditional Greek dress. And the picture that he posted matched, one of the pictures that he posted of Athenian armor matched the armor that I saw. So my experience went from being unverified personal gnosis to verified personal gnosis because of that and a couple of other details we were able to historically verify. So that is a more, I guess you could say, scientific version. I mean, is it absolutely, like, is it data? Is it completely, like, unfalsifiable? No, but it is a more scientific and methodical classification that pagans can use to figure out to what degree our experience is applicable to deity, if we're interpreting it right, if the experience is deity itself.
Exactly. Basically, BPG is the closest you can get to knowledge in spirituality.
Yes.
And it also tends to require quite a bit of training within the particular mythos in which your pantheon resides in, which is also one of the aspects that makes learning mythology very, very useful for polytheism.
Well, yeah, because most polytheists are not mythic literalists. We don't think that the mythology is, like, gospel. We don't think it literally happened.
Wait, well, hold up. You mean the clouds are not actually Umir's brain?
No, absolutely not. I'm sorry, Calon. Like, we've already taken samples of them, and there's just not enough electrical activity to contain a brain of that size. There just isn't.
Wait, there isn't a fence made around the world of his eyebrows?
Nope. And unfortunately, like, humans were not cut in half, and that's not why we're looking for our soulmates. Like, I'm sorry, Plato lied to you, Thomas. Like, I'm so sorry.
No, this can't be. Okay, hold up. Can you at least, or
I've
maybe
not
we
read
can meet somewhere in the middle. Can you at least tell me that the sun is drawn by a horse chariot named Skinfraxti?
Well, I mean, the jury's kind of still out on that one, but I'm pretty sure we've gotten enough shots of the sun from various telescopes to be pretty sure that if Apollon is driving that chariot, or if Helios is, that it's got to be invisible at the very least.
Damn it.
I would just like to say that I haven't read the particular portion of Plato where he talks about the soulmates thing, so
it's in Symposium.
Yeah, I haven't read Symposium in a while, so anyway.
Jeez, Thomas, we're about to release a video on this. Catch up.
Sorry.
Damn, hold up. I need to recover from that shock that the Norse myths aren't literally true.
All right, see you later, Sassy.
Or that the Tigris and Euphrates aren't literally Enki's semen.
No, they are. No.
Okay, that one can be literal. That one absolutely can. We don't know what God semen is made of, Thomas. God. Don't
Okay.
don't shit on all of her dreams. Not all of
Okay.
them. Just some of them.
Thank the God. Okay, that's a relief.
Okay,
Alright.
but coming back to the topic, this segues really interestingly. Some people have asked me, well, if you're not a myth like literalist, well, why do you study mythology? And UpG, BPG, and SPG is the reason for that. Like, it helps you to learn more about the gods and other people's experiences of the gods.
Yeah, like if I get a haunting feeling and that there's a sort of presence around, and then suddenly a raven flies by, then I can use mythology to look up and say, oh, this is Odin coming around, and then I can be scared for my life.
Yeah, I get a ton of VPG from Odin. He seems to like making a show of himself and being very obvious.
I've gotten that from Hermes a lot. Like, Hermes is a lot more directly involved. Athena and the Mosai, which, for those who aren't familiar with Greek mythology, the Mosai that's the Greek name for the muses. They tend to be a lot more directly involved in my life.
Oh, so it's... Oh, sorry. I was about to ask, it's Musei then in the singular.
Yes.
Okay, sorry.
So, like, they're a lot more directly involved in my life. Like, I tend to get answers, like, snap, snap, snap kind of thing from them, and they tend to be fairly clear, hit you over the head answers. I've actually recently, Dionysos, Calon and I have been having conversations because Dionysos has made himself apparent in my life a lot more recently, too, whereas, like, Zeus or Zeus and Hera are both a bit more distant, which makes sense when you look toward what they do in the mythology. I haven't sought out as strong of relationships with some of the others, but the ones that I worship every day, I tend to have a lot more direct experiences with them, and looking back into their mythology and doing things like reading devotionals and reading myths from the original sources, I can glean like what some of these experiences might mean, or like if I'm interpreting them correctly.
Exactly.
And like Calon just saying,
actually...
it's equally a chance that raven might actually just be Raven, and you should be scared for your life. So that's still the appropriate response.
I mean, ravens are cool. They're actually animals that eat corpses, which is why it's fitting that they're associated with the god of death, Odin. One of the gods of death.
Well, yeah, but I was talking about Raven the Spirit because, I'm a multi-traditionalist.
Okay.
So what you're saying is that you haven't gotten a pact with the Raven Queen? Sorry, that's a D&D reference.
No.
That's a 4th edition D&D reference.
I'm kind of free.
So coming back to your point, Calon, sorry,
yeah.
I did the ADHD thing again.
What was my point? Now I'm ADD too, so now I forget my point.
Your point is squirrels. That is what happened. Or ravens, I guess.
No, snakes. Snakes are cute. I learned that snakes are sacred to the thunder gods.
Have you never seen a baby raven?
Apparently.
Like, baby ravens are the most adorable little angry puffballs you will ever see.
Oh, they are. They're so cute. I wish you didn't have to be licensed to raise one.
Or, well, actually, you say baby raven, I raise you a kestrel. Those things are adorable. Yeah. Anyway.
So, I guess...
So, yeah, getting back to the whole...
Calon found her point. Let her speak.
Via's turtle right now.
I said Calon found her point. Let her speak.
Via's turtle?
Turtling is eating right now.
Via's turtle is the cutest.
Yes, Via's turtle is the cutest.
Anyhow, yeah, with when it comes to BPG and whatnot, being fluent within the myths, especially in the myths of other pantheons, and this is why I like to emphasize that it's important to learn about other traditions in order to be able to relate with other pagans. if you don't know the other traditions, you're not going to understand the BPG stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well,
And that's important for connecting, so to speak.
well, and I
Mhm.
mean, that's also kind of is another dividing line between Christian dogmatism and that sort of Christian distancing and the way that pagans tend to view each other's. It is possible for me to have an experience with a god that is outside of the pantheon that I currently worship if that god so chooses to interact with me. Like, I don't believe that my gods are the only ones
you
that
could have a
exist, they're just the ones I
visitation
pay
from.
attention to.
Yeah, you could, for example, Shango could, for whatever reason, decide to strike at your door tonight, for whatever reason.
Mhm.
Shango, for those that don't know, is the Yoruban deity of lightning. He's kind of like African Thor, except he also used to be mortal. Yeah, you have apotheosis in Yoruban mythos. Or Eshu can randomly just trick up Thomas for whatever reason, because I'm going to use they, because Eshu is actually kind of an androgynous being. He's a confusing god, which you expect for a god of paradoxes.
Well,
But
and
yeah,
like that scene in syncretism, which we talked about in our last meeting, Via and I did, but that scene in syncretism and in multi-traditionalist circles as well. Like, I, for example, if an Egyptian deity, which I've had personal experiences with a couple of Egyptian deities, but the most strong ones I've had have been with the Greek gods, which is why I'm a Hellenic Reconstructionist rather than I think it's Semitic? Or is it
Kemetic.
Kemetic Reconstructionist?
Kemetic is Egyptian. Semitic is Mesopotamia. Is more the Mesopotamian group. Yeah.
Or Canaan and the Levant.
Western Middle Eastern.
So, Kemetic, the reason that I'm not a Kemetic polytheist is because the experiences I've had with the Greek gods have been significantly more intense. And I was kind of a jerk after my first one. One of these days I will tell my deconversion story, and you all will probably get to laugh at me for giving Hermes and Athena the middle finger. But,
I laugh at it every time you bring it up, actually.
yeah, well, because you know the story. You're one of the few people I've shared it with. So, there are a number of Hellenic polytheists that I've met within the organization that I'm a part of that actually honor the Egyptian deities as Greek deities, because there was a time, specifically during Alexander the Great's time with Cleopatra, where those two kingdoms were one. And so there's interaction in history, their historical precedent for like worshiping the Egyptian gods right alongside the Greeks.
Most notably, Isis and Serapis.
But also Toth, because Toth gifted, Toth gifted Hermes with a new epithet, Hermes Trismegistos.
Yeah, and there was a syncretized version of Hermes, I think called Hermanubis.
Yes, Hermanubis. That's him in his. Psychopomp aspect.
Mm-hmm.
What's a psychopomp? For those that don't know.
A psychopomp is a guide of the dead. So, like, they're the people that guide the souls to the afterlife. So, in Hermes' case, he guides the souls to the river Styx and gets them to Calon, so that they can get onto the boat if they've got the fare.
There we go. Yeah.
So, and Anubis is the judge of souls in Egyptian mythology. So, seeing those two things side by side, Persephone usually fits that role in various forms of Greek mythology. I haven't seen other people who do, but like Persephone usually fills that role. And so, Hermanubis, like the Egyptians saw it, like Hermes being the guide of the dead, and mixed that with Anubis being the judge of souls.
Mm-hmm. And it makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
So, yeah. Because we see the gods as actual living entities, not mere thought forms, or however others may choose to see, or as an exclusive monotheistic representative aspect of Yahweh. Sorry. Mixed my words up there.
Well, and this is where hard polytheist gets into trouble with soft polytheists, because, like, soft polytheists kind of do a very similar thing to what the Christians do, which is, oh, well, they're all just aspects of these one or two deities or this one source, and you're anthropomorphizing it, and so did the cultures, and you don't actually realize that you're not interacting with somebody new, you're interacting just with this one entity, and it's just one face of them.
Yep, Shango is totally Thor.
Am I correct in saying that there are various aspects of soft polytheism in various Wiccan organizations?
It depends on the Wiccan tradition.
But it really depends on the Wiccan. If you want to go Garnerian, for example, then in the classic duotheistic Wiccan model, then yes, that would be a form of soft polytheism, because it is believed that all gods and goddesses are merely aspects of the two main god and goddess, who are in turn, when combined, form what is called the All.
Well, yeah, and there's also some Wiccan traditions that I've met that believe that there are a certain number, and the number is kind of arbitrary, of god archetypes, and that all the various deities and the stories and the deities were conceived from these archetypal deities interacting with their various cultures, and that we, because we cannot understand them, had to anthropomorphize them and had to create these stories to understand the archetypes through our cultures.
Yeah.
Which I think is the most lenient version of soft polytheism that I've seen.
Yeah, it's the one that, to me, it comes the closest to any form of really acceptability.
But
but I still don't. No, Shango is not Thor. Don't say that he is.
And Thor is not Zeus, or Zeus, depending on how you pronounce it.
Right. And Tyr also not Zeus. If you get that reference, Aliakai.
Yeah, I do.
What reference?
Tyr being Zeus.
Was that what Tacitus thought?
No, that's from linguistic. No, that's from linguistic reconstruction. Basically, Tyr goes back. Basically, both Tyr and Zeus are cognates.
Yeah, there's also been some argument about Baal and certain aspects of Baal, either Baal being Zeus or Zeus, which I actually just got sent a paper by a good friend that I'm going to be reading on that, or that that he got his thunder aspect, that he was originally a sky god and he got his thunder aspect from interaction with the Canaanites.
Well, if you look at the depictions in sculpture, there is a similarity between Zeus / Jupiter and Baal.
Similarity, yes, but
they're both sky gods.
Yeah, but I'm referring specifically to the sort of the figure of holding a thunderbolt in one hand and about to basically javelin throw it.
Hey, Jared. Hey, Triatail.
Oh, Tria here. It's here. Hey, Tria. And hey, Jared.
Hey, Mistress Angelica's here, too.
Awesome.
I'm feeling the love tonight. I'm apologize for anybody who had a hard time finding the stream. OBS decided it didn't feel like cooperating with YouTube, so when I scheduled the stream, it didn't latch on to the stream I scheduled, and ended up creating a new one. So, my apologies for people who had difficulty getting to us. I'm gonna chalk it up to, like, Ocean has cursed us all with pagan tech problems. Hey, AR!
He said the tech gremlins. Those damn tech gremlins.
Anyway, we should probably get back on the main topic of the stream, because we've kind of drifted to talking about different syncretizations of different gods together.
Excellent moderation, Via. So, I guess coming back to sort of the Christian Stockholm Syndrome thing, I noticed early on that it was very difficult for me to acknowledge these very direct experiences that I had. In fact, even though I had already converted to paganism, I was kind of Wiccan at the beginning of my journey. I've only been a Hellenic polytheist for a few years. I went Wiccan to, like, okay, so I went Christian to atheist to agnostic to Wiccan to generalized eclectic pagan to Hellenic Reconstructionist. I have a very complicated journey. But when I first came into Wicca and I started having these personal experiences with various deities, as I was quite rudely trying on various pantheons to try to get used to this concept of being able to worship the gods that I wanted to, I had a really hard time acknowledging the intense and very real nature of these experiences. I resorted to materialism. I was afraid that it was demons. And for a long time, because of that, I actually took a lot of comfort in this idea of, in Wicca, they talk about not all acts of love and pleasure are my rituals. All life is my child, and like it's in the Wiccan Rede. And so I took a lot of comfort in not having to give offerings or sacrifices, even though there was a part of me that really wanted to live the old religions the way that they used to be done. And I was scared of that because I was scared of making offerings to idols and because I was scared to even have statues. You know what I mean? Like there was that latent Christianity that was killing me. And I'm curious if either Thomas or Via or even Calon, if you've had, I know you were never Christian, but if you've had any of that sort of hegemonic influence mess with your practice.
Not really, except for Christians wrecking my idols.
Oh, have Christians actually done damage to your stuff?
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. Christians are jerks in the South.
Do you have anything outside of your house, or was this like a friend?
It was outside of my house. Basically, I had set it up. It was near a Christian place. Came back the next day, and it was in pieces.
Oh, God. I'm so sorry that happened to you, Calon.
Yeah, yeah. That's never fun. Totally ruins everything.
Fortunately, I've never had any experiences like that. Again, like I said earlier, I grew up in a rather liberal Presbyterian household, so there wasn't any kind of overbearing dogma forced onto me.
Have you ever felt that, like, you were concerned about... You talked about not doing things right. Like, could you expand on some of your concerns around that? Like, I know that can be a problem for Reconstructionists in particular.
I think that was primarily a anxiety or OCD thing. Just sort of just starting out in terms of a practice, but it wasn't anything like demons or anything like that.
Via, I know that you're a lot more eclectic. Have you had any of those sorts of experiences?
Yeah, there's definitely the anxiety of trying to worship a god in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways I've figured out how to get around that is really my more eclectic approach to it, where I base it off of what I try and what works, instead of specifically only looking to history for answers on how to venerate the god.
Mm-hmm. So you rely heavily on your UPG then?
Yeah, definitely. Both. Well, there's a bit of UPG, but there's also a lot of SPG and VPG, because I get these experiences, and I also, after I get these experiences, compare them with other people and with like historical sources.
I think community can be really important in that, and I think that this is a good time to mention that, like, finding a pagan community, even if it's just online, can be really, really helpful in dealing both with latent Christianity and with the sort of Christian Stockholm syndrome that you can get from...
It also could be really hard.
Yeah.
And
go on, Calon.
And we actually, in terms of like pagans, that we can usually tell like when someone's been freshly pagan, generally by how Christian they act.
Mm-hmm.
Like they'll be like, oh, they'll worry themselves to death about, oh, do I believe, is this really the right thing that I'm believing and whatnot? And it's like, form your own opinions, and then they get stumped because they think there's some sort of dogma that's supposed to be like shoved down their throat or something.
Well, and I think that it also tends to lead us towards folkism as well, to a certain extent. This idea that there is
there's this focus trap where, which I don't, which the idea being that, and that can come from ancestor worship, but which is why when we go into that aspect of paganism, we need to be very particularly careful about considering who our ancestors are.
We should probably define folkism for anybody that wasn't present during that stream.
Folkism is Nazism.
Effectively,
Pagan
it's
style.
With the Viking hat.
One could argue that to a certain extent Judaism is a focused tradition. It's a belief that there's one particular like group and generally ethnically defined that is allowed to worship the gods.
And
And
there's kind of a bit of like that gatekeeping there, but there's also there's also a way to kind of integrate yourself with the culture and like become Jewish.
well, yeah, but you still have to be kind of accepted within like Jewish tradition in order to do so. Or you have to marry in.
Mm-hmm.
Which I know a number of Jewish families. So I've mentioned before on other streams, on other places, that one of my partners, I'm polyamorous in addition to being polytheist. Unfortunately, if I get too heavily involved in either side of that conversation, I'll start conflating the two and using the wrong word because poly everything.
She is pure poly.
I am only poly. I am poly everything.
She is poly. That's her. That's good. She's no longer Aliakai. She's just poly.
Aliakai. God dang it, Calon. Oh, I will train you one of these days. So, like, one of my partners, his father actually got kicked out of his family because he married a Catholic. That is the Catholic partner that I talk about all the time, who himself got kicked out of the family because he was no longer Catholic and is now in a polyamorous relationship. So everybody getting kicked out of every family on that side. But that is something that I had a little bit of experience with, which is why I call Judaism a focused tradition, because there are certain sects of Judaism that do that. If you marry outside of the Jewish, I guess, you can argue about whether or not it's an ethnicity. It's been treated as one for a long period of time. Like,
it still is.
Yeah. But it is as much a religion and religious practice as it ever was a tribe. Like, the two are kind of mixed in such a way that it's hard to tell what you can classify it as. So I'm not going to make a designation because I don't feel educated enough to do so. But I think that coming back to Christianity, latent Christianity and that Christian Stockholm syndrome can make it feel like an absolute. And Calon, when this point came up when you were mentioning people talking about, did I choose the right, like, did I make the right choice? And am I choosing the right thing to worship the gods? I've heard a lot of I guess, hemming and hawing about, did I choose the right, like, pantheon or the right Reconstructionist tradition? Like, as though you're completely locked into those gods and that way of practice always, that eclecticism can't possibly be an option. You know, there's a lot of people in the Reconstructionist community that would take a dunk on me for saying that eclecticism is something that's acceptable, but I genuinely believe it is. Like, to a certain degree.
It's not only acceptable, it's acceptable because it's also historically based.
Yeah, like, I mean, even, especially in Hellenism, there are so many different versions of what you would call the hearth cult, or the personal worship practice. There are so many different versions of myths in Hellenism, of, you know, festivals, like the Attic festival calendar that a lot of the organizations use isn't the only one. And in fact, like, in Kemetic mythology as well, you know, the Egyptian mythology, there were certain cities that revered some gods over others. Like, they saw Bast and Bubastis, they saw her as the queen of the sky and the ruler of the other gods, rather than Ra or Re.
And you have actually something similar to this in Sumer. Although in that case, it was more various cities being dedicated to various gods.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea
like
that
Inanna being of Uruk, Enki of Eridu, and a whole bunch of other places. Babylon for Marduk. And
I don't consider Marduk really to be Sumerian. I consider Marduk to be Babylonian.
Okay.
So there's that.
I was just giving an example.
That's fine.
So there is not only a historical precedent for multi-traditionalism and syncretism, which we talked about before, but this idea that you can only worship one set of gods, that you're locked into one particular practice, that's ultimately, you could call it almost uniquely Christian. And it's something we carry with us, and an insecurity and a certainty we desire that we carry with us when we leave that religion.
It's kind of funny for me to see personally.
Yeah,
Because I was never raised Christian, so I don't have these. Like, it's a lot more fluid for me. If it's kind of hard to describe. Like, I would have no problem right now going and making an offering to, say, Oshumare or Obatala. Both of those are orishas in Yoruban tradition, and then going and making an offering to Thor.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any issue with that. But others feel like, oh no, I have to worship exclusively exclusively the Norse gods, Odin, Thor, Freya, Freyr, and so forth, and I can't dare go near the Yoruban tradition or something of that nature. Now, of course, some of them will say, oh, I can't go near these dirty Greeks.
Well, I stopped. I'm sorry. The moment that you mentioned that, I'd stopped being able to understand what you're saying. Like, all I hear is bar, 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 and that's all I'm going to hear for the rest of this conversation. Sorry, Calon.
Barbaroi Logoi. All of this is Barbaroi Logoi.
Oh, gods. So, for anybody who's not familiar, because the joke's funnier when you explain it, so there was a reference in ancient Greece to Barbaroi Logoi, which Thomas can pronounce much better than me because I'm still learning modern Greek. I haven't even gotten into ancient yet. This idea that any
I've done
language...
3 semesters of ancient Greek, by the way.
You are lucky, and I'm jealous, and like that's an advantage you have on me. Congratulations.
I have a Greek grammar.
I have a Greek system that I've been slowly using to learn, but I haven't gotten around to ancient Greek yet. I'm still trying to learn modern Greek to get, pronunciations
Ancient
proper.
Greek is prettier.
It is prettier. Okay, so now that we've squirreled off down the Greek topic, there was a joke that was frequently said, or rather, it was actually more of a prejudice, really, where any language that wasn't Greek all they could hear was bar, 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 bar. So, that's actually part of where the term barbarian came from. As a specifically used as a derogatory term for somebody that is violent and uncivilized.
Yeah, like the Greeks.
Calon, we can't be friends anymore. I'm sorry. Yesterday, you ruined my ears with Marcus Aurelius, and now today, you're calling me dirty. I know I have to do my purifications, but still.
How am I wrong? I mean, you're not a Norse, so how am I wrong?
Okay, so
yes,
for everybody in the chat, Calon is officially a focus, just saying.
Nah. Of course we're joking, but yeah.
Yes. No, all of the love.
Exactly.
But yeah, I think that is a uniquely Christian thing that we carry with us, this idea that there is one right way, one right, true, and only way, as you'd frequently hear, to worship the gods, and one pantheon you have to then commit to. And I think that is something that even in Reconstructionist circles, where we're trying to reconstruct specific religions, I think that coming back to syncretism and multi-traditionalism from, our previous stream, I think that that's something that's harmful to the movement. Because I've learned quite a lot from a number of heathens that I've talked to. I mean, everybody, sucks Ocean's nuts off anytime he comes up in a stream, but, he is a fantastic person to talk to about, theology and to talk to about philosophy, and I've learned a lot from him. And, I'd hope that I've been able to contribute anything back. But Calon, who's also a heathen and a Sumerian Reconstructionist, we've had some fantastic discussions on the Greek gods and on Kemetic deities and other things. And I have had experiences with other gods. So I can't say that I can 100% only ever do things the Greek way or only ever worship the Greek gods, given that I feel as though there are other deities, particularly spirits, within my own tradition, I'm Haida, that I also want to honor.
And also, just as an example, I just learned about Oshunmare being, so whenever you see a rainbow, in Yoruba, you see actually Oshumare, who is a rainbow serpent. And since they actually have a god that's a rainbow snake, that god is so totally going into my praxis. That's not even debatable.
Yeah, now here's the question, though. As Reconstructionists...
But many people would say that what I just said, is something that I shouldn't do because Oshumare is outside of Sumer and outside of Norse tradition.
So if we really want to get into a tizzy, is it ethical to reconstruct the Aztec religion?
I'm not even going to cut that one.
Oh, of course. Of course. Why wouldn't it be?
I mean, I guess you'd have to find, like, at what point
I mean, no one would want to sacrifice Trump, that's for sure. I mean,
Okay, so hello to the NSA, now that sacrifice and Trump are in the same words. We're going to live stream ripping a symbolic heart out at some point.
Mm-hmm.
But no, like, that's entirely serious. That's an interesting point. At some point, I'd like to have a discussion on Reconstructionism and on to what degree do we have to reconstruct certain rites and to what degree is it acceptable to make deviations. Like, for example, most modern-day sects don't practice animal sacrifice, despite that being a huge part of Hellenic public ritual.
Most pagans, like European pagans, don't, but I'm pretty sure in like Yoruba land, also in the Hindu areas as well as particular Asian areas, they actually do practice animal sacrifice still.
Well,
and
I said most Hellenic Reconstructionists.
There's a lot of animal sacrifice in East Asian traditions still.
Well, I said most Hellenic Reconstructionists.
Oh, okay, I didn't hear the Hellenic part. Sorry, it must be the Barber Boy.
Bar, 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 bar.
Bar, 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 bar. But yeah, like, in response to Rilia in the chat, Santeria is a really interesting mix.
Oh, I can handle this one. Santeria is a mixture of like Catholicism and Yoruban religion. Basically what it is that when during the slave trade, they took from oil. Oil is Yoruba land, and they brought over their gods. And of course with Christian missionaries, and also because of sort of how the Yoruba religion is structured, you have this syncretism between Yoruba and various denominations of Christianity. And so that's how you get the Orishas and Vodou, as well as in like Santeria, Umbanda, and various other traditions.
Well, and if you want to talk about other Christian syncretism, Dutch powwow is another really fascinating. That's more of a magical tradition, but it's really fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And then there's Haitian voodoo.
Yeah, I just mentioned that. It's a Yoruban tradition. Well, Yoruban/Christian.
Mm-hmm.
So, and because those are living traditions, nobody would really question them. Am I doing it right? Well, are you practicing? That's kind of the answer a lot of the time. If you've dedicated yourself to be more Reconstructionist, I think that at that point, it pays attention. It pays to pay attention.
Come up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Because like I have to consider, is what I'm doing at least somewhat in line with how the ancient Norsemen or the ancient Sumerians would have done it.
And I think that there is also a certain amount of, if this religion were allowed to evolve into modernity, what ways would things have changed? Like, one of the things that Hellenic Reconstructionists do in lieu of animal sacrifice for public ritual is baking up cakes in the shape of a sacred animal, like, for the god being honored, and then breaking that cake, and part goes to the deity, and the other part goes to, whoever's got the background, that's really loud. But, like, part of it goes to the deity, and part of it goes to the practitioners or the worshippers after the ceremony. So that's one way in which that practice has been carried forward. And that's one way where, like, in a no longer primarily agrarian society where animal sacrifice may have fallen out of fashion, that possibly could have changed.
Exactly. And, yeah, generally with that, I tend to look towards some living traditions to establish that. So, like, I might borrow from, say, Shintoism in a way, or the modern Inuit religion. Because there are polytheistic traditions that have actually survived.
Mm-hmm.
Yoruba is actually a tradition that has survived, for example. You can still go and find a high priestess of Yamoja.
Well, yeah, and there's also Wonkantonka and other indigenous faiths that you can...
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Although they view their gods in a more interesting way as well, though.
Yeah,
it's
like...
kind of curious.
Most indigenous gods are much more ever present if they were considered gods at all. There's a lot of like spirits as well.
Yeah, it's totemism basically is what a certain amount of it amounts to. Like even with the Cherokee creation myth, which I will save for telling another time, but
we can do an episode on that at some point.
Oh yeah, we will. We'll do a mythological Monday on it.
Honestly, I'd love to have Naka come in and do the voice for that, because like Naka has heritage, if I recall correctly.
I think he's Mohawk, though, isn't he?
I thought he said he was Cherokee. Maybe it was somebody else.
He could also be a mix.
Yeah, he could. I found out recently I'm a mix. I haven't told you that yet, but I found out that my great-grandmother, the one on the Haida side, her first husband, the person she had the child with, was actually Sewali.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, but the only thing that got passed down in my family was Haida.
I mean, which tradition is really more in danger, Haida or Sewali?
Haida, definitely.
Yeah, so it was probably...
the Sewali band is a part of the Stolo supernation.
Oh, okay. I gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But coming back.
But in short, to go back to my point, gods there don't actually make the world, it's the animals. And the animals are seen on par with humans. In fact, there is a period where it is said that there is a period where animals and humans could actually talk to one another. And
well,
so
yeah,
you have that whole mythos.
And in one of the Haida creation myths, Raven comes across a small group of humans like inside of a clamshell, and when they all die by his negligence, he decides it would be a lot of fun, and this is a typical thing with Raven and Haida mythology. It would be a lot of fun if I made big versions of these that I could bother and harass and, mess with. And so one of the creation myths for the Haida people themselves is that Raven created us just to fuck with us.
I think that's the true myth, really. Screw all of evolution.
Honestly,
Screw all of that.
I've fucked around with like the idea of basically a trickster god creating us all just to fuck with us and mess with us and fuck us over.
Well, yeah, that's exactly one of the Haida creation myths. The Haida myth of Raven and the Sun. And again, I'll be happy to write some of these up because these are widely available stories. One of the myths of Haida and the Sun is that Raven ends up really wanting the Sun because it's messing with him that this older dude is keeping it in a box because he's afraid that his granddaughter is ugly. And so he keeps it in this box and won't let anybody have it. And what ends up happening with her is Raven, she gets knocked up and Raven infuses himself into her womb because he's a jerk like that. He gets given birth to and he gets spoiled because, what grandfather doesn't dote on their grandchild, right? And he gets closer and closer, every day. Can you open this box? Can you open that one? Can I just hold it? Until it finally opens up the sun. And he grabs the sun and throws it into the sky so that he can, screw around with humans again and so that he can see the fish. And when the sun, when he's soaring into the sky with the sun, that's when Eagle first sees him. And that's how their feud begins. The best translation I've ever seen, it said, and his eyes fell for the first time on his target. And that's very similar to the version that my family told me growing up. So, there's lots of interesting, the trickster gods just did stuff because they wanted to fuck with people, or because they were bored, or because it was getting in the way of their trickstering.
Oh, yeah, that reminds me of Issue and all this stuff people's, or still pulls today, actually, I should say. But yeah, all that stuff, that will be stuff we will be continuing to go into. in further dates.
We are actually bringing back Mythological Mondays, by the ways, guys. We're in the process of getting a piece on... I referenced Plato and the Symposium and people getting cut in half earlier. There's a Greek creation myth for humanity that has to do with soulmates, and that's where the idea of soulmates came from in philosophy originally. I don't know if there's older versions of it, but it's the one that I think is most well known. And currently, Cingeto, who is dealing with some personal stuff, he's moving out for college, wasn't able to make it, but he's doing some gorgeous animation work for that. And sometime within the next month or two, we should be able to start doing Mythological Mondays again. So that's going to be something to look forward to. If you're not subscribed yet, you totally should be.
Exactly, and just for general content as well. We also have plenty of other stuff planned for the future.
Yeah,
Some of it we're going to keep a surprise.
Yes, we have a fairly exciting collaboration coming down the pipeline that I can't really talk about yet because of the nature of what we're doing, but I'm
It's super
excited.
secret spy stuff.
Yep, it is super secret stuff.
We're finally bringing down Christendom.
We will bring down all of Christendom.
Yeah, Christianity will be no more.
It's totally not about the revolution and tearing down the government and stuff like that.
Nope, there's
No,
no political
not at
content
all.
on this channel at all. There never will be. By the way, thank you, Some Random Geek, for the congrats on the 150 subs. We're actually pretty happy about it ourselves.
Yeah, I'm amazed that we made it there.
So I'm hoping that we'll be able to do some more live streams sort of on some of these broad topics. I'm hoping, and if anybody in the chat is a Reconstructionist, I'm hoping to be able to invite a few people on for one of these streams on the subject of Reconstructionism. Oh, hey, Chris is in the chat.
Oh,
Hi, Chris. I'm actually constantly surprised. People actually know about us.
So I'm
Tears to
hoping
my
to...
eyes.
I'm hoping to invite a few
Anyway, by the way,
Reconstructionists on for one of our
by the
topics
way,
in the
if-
future. Go on, Via.
If any of you haven't heard of Chris, the biblical history skeptic, you should all go check out his channel. He makes amazing content.
We're
Okay,
doing
I'll
all
do
right.
that.
We went off into the weeds on trickster deities because all of us are theology geeks.
Yeah, to pull it
And
back.
trickster deities are such fun.
To pull it back to the main subject, kind of, when I was still in my Christian-centered form of Satanism that I practiced for a while, kind of my theology was that Yahweh was a trickster god, and that was essentially the reason he created us, just to completely fuck us over.
Yeah. I mean, that's... Honestly, I feel like Yahweh is kind of just a jealous deity. I don't want to just go and trash talk God, because I know that there's still a chance...
That you'll meet him.
Well, I mean, I know there's still a chance that he's real, for one thing. And I know there's also still a chance that...
I mean, I know people that have apparently met him. They describe him as kind of like a shifty, almost schizophrenic-like deity.
So paranoid, really paranoid. That sounds
Like paranoid and constantly, sort of changing.
Yeah, and... I think the big thing for me with him and other people. Hey, Witch is in the chat. Hey, What the Craft.
All right, I need to ban her. Sorry. Bye.
But I think the thing for me
She's
is
a
more
coffee
that I'm
drinker,
concerned
so,
that there's
yeah.
Christians in the audience at the moment, and I don't want to be overly insulting, but I think that Yahweh is very warlike, and in his mythology, if you take the Bible as real, he's very mean. He's kind of a cruel god in my estimacy, and so even if I did believe that he is absolutely 100% real, and even if I had strong experiences with him, which I've said to a lot of people, I think your God's real, I just think he's a dick. I don't necessarily know if he's one I would want to worship because of that. In the same way that you've expressed reservations about Loki before in his sort of malevolence.
Loki. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Loki, by the way, generally,
That's
from
pretty
the
much.
best of what I can tell, is pretty malevolent. He doesn't really like humans. I know there are Lokians that will disagree with me, but when you look at the mythos, that's sort of how his character is. He's more like self-serving than Odin, and whenever he makes up for something, it's always because he's being threatened by something else.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
I can
So,
imagine, in a way, kind of seeing him as a symbol, like atheistic Satanists see Satan as a symbol of rebellion and uh, essentially selfishness and
I mean, he kind of
wanting
can
to
be
do
that, but that's.
selfish
Mm-hmm. You know, I see that view, but when it comes to like the Norse gods, the dichotomy isn't really like good and evil. It's more order, the Osir, or the Asir, versus the Thursar, the horribly translated English word giants. Like the giants tend to be more chaotic entities.
So we're getting pretty close to an hour and a half. Do we want to, since we have 12 viewers in the stream at the moment, and we've got a number of people in the chat, do we want to turn and let the chat tell some of their personal stories about feeling distanced from the God of the Bible if they're prior Christians? Or do we want to do we want to wrap up? What would we like to do? Because I know everybody
Let's have
wanted
an
to do
open
a
forum.
hangout at the end.
Why not?
Yeah,
All right.
I'd love to hear what other people's experiences are.
Okay,
Mhm.
so in the chat, do you guys have any experiences with the Bible and feeling distance from the Christian God? If you're a polytheist, do you feel as though those experiences have affected your attempts at, like, practicing your faith? Do you feel as though it hurts the actual practitioners of Christianity? Like, what thoughts do you guys have? I'd love to hear them. And honestly, I think we'd all love to discuss them, wouldn't we?
Mm-hmm.
Calon, Thomas, Via. Is everybody awake?
I'm awake.
No, I'm not.
I'm getting a little hungry for dinner, but that's just me.
I mean, I'm starving too, but that's because I'm dumb and haven't eaten all day. Because I'm dumb and keep forgetting to eat.
Yeah, in ancient Near East gods tend to not be the nicest. It's kind of weird how an ancient Near Eastern god became one of the largest came to have some of the largest followings in the world in that way.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a lot of evidence that Yahweh, there's references to metallurgy, that he might have been a metallurgy god, but I mean, Triatel, if you want to tell us your story, it's more about you feeling distanced from the God because of the way that the Bible portrays him, because of the way that, like, the Christian church does. Like, not being able to feel fully connected because of the way the Bible talks about him, because of the way the Bible talks about us. Like, at the very beginning of the stream, Callan, would you like to recap kind of what we talked about with the Bible kind of trashing on humanity and that sort of thing?
Basically, there's a trap where you have to have you can never really reach God, but he supposedly loves you and wants you to reach him. So you're always receiving negative and positive reinforcement. So the closer you get, basically like the worse you feel in a way.
Well, in part because the Bible says we are ugly and sinful and hateful to God.
Right.
Like, just from the moment that we're born because of what Eve did. And so, like, we are born damned, effectively, from the moment that we're born. And yet, like, Jesus says, you can only have a relationship with God through me. But at the same time, Jesus is also supposed to be God, but we can have images of him, but we can't have images of God himself, and the Israelites got fucked over for doing that. And Chris, we did actually mention earlier, we were wishing that you were here, but we did mention earlier that the golden calf story was referenced to another god. But, like, we're not even allowed to have pictures of him. Like, we can't feel close to him because he's so incredibly distant. We only have this, like, we're not even allowed to picture what he is in our mind. Apparently Chris doesn't buy the metallurgy arguments.
I don't really either. I think it would be quite ironic if he was the metallurgy god, but he couldn't defeat the people with iron chariot.
Yeah, I mean, it's more... I think that the evidence is more clear that he was a war god.
Yeah, definitely.
So Mistress Angelica says she gets confused when Christians say they have a personal relationship with either God or Jesus because she never had that experience. So my question to the panel and to the chat is, do you think part of that reason is because we are mentally told to distance ourselves, like, from that deity as, like, Christians, if you are a Christian, and that could put a barrier in your mind to experiencing that God, a la, like, Thomas, you know how some people, like Butler and others, talk about in Platonism, you can put barriers between yourself and the gods, but the gods have never left. Do you think that there might be something like that going on with Christianity, with Christians, and that's part of the reason why a lot of them feel distance?
I think it could be, especially since priests a lot of times can be gatekeepers. Like, just look at the Roman Catholic Church, for example.
Yeah, it's especially bad in Catholic tradition where you have to go through a priest or a bishop or the Pope to actually talk to God at all.
I don't see there being a similarity in Platonism. I think that's just a theological detail, but Platonists who are polytheists still give sacrifices and venerations to the gods. So,
well, what I was talking about was I've heard Platonists talk about how, and actually I think Angelo on Hearth of Hellenism has an interesting article on this, which I'm not sure if I agree with his take, but he talks about when you feel distant from the gods, that ultimately what you've done is put up a mental barrier that the gods are not gone, they haven't distanced themselves from you, you have distanced yourself from them. You are no longer open to feeling a connection with them.
well, I think in that sense, I think it's just, well, from my own personal experience, I've been going through a period of depression for over a year now, and it's been and I definitely feel a little different, and I don't really feel as capable or as willing to look to the gods. So,
yeah, when Butler posted that, Athena broke the plane of the vase. Like, don't tell don't tell Athena how big your problems are. Tell your problems how big Athena is. That resonated with me so hard. I was like, yeah, because I've been going through some tough stuff lately.
Yeah.
Coming back to the chat really quick, Relia says, I've had more issues with my pagan experiences because of latent Christianity than Yahweh. I never felt encouraged to reach out to Yahweh. That's an interesting point. It depends, I guess, on the sect you grow up in, but to a certain degree, there's this pressure, pray to God every night. Some of the sects, like Catholicism, have, like, rote prayers, some of them don't. But this idea to reach out to have a personal experience with Yahweh doesn't exist at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, really, if you want to expand on what your latent Christianity issues have been with your pagan practice, like, I would love to hear that story. Jared Whitaker down here says, I don't understand why Christians talk about Jesus more than God. So I have a very, I was talking to Calon about this. We mentioned it earlier in the stream. I have a very almost condescending theory about that, if you guys want to hear it.
Sure.
I think it's because, so with the Trinity, right, which we talked about the Trinity being incoherent, but, like, let's grant it for a minute. With the Trinity, Jesus is supposed to be God. Jesus also had a physical body. Jesus had a face. He was supposed to be, human at some point. So that means there can be a picture of him. And most churches actually do have images of Jesus on the cross, sacrificing himself. And that sacrifice being such a core belief to Christianity. You know, like the one definition that all Christians agree on is you accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior and accept his sacrifice for your sins, right?
I mean, Gnostics might be
Yeah,
a
but
little
we
bit
don't
of an
even know that
exception.
much about the Gnostics, as far as I know.
We still know some stuff about them, but I would say yes, that a lot of Gnostics would agree with that. Although for some of them, it's also more about how to behave, how to act, to get with them on that. But we can go over that another time, and I still have to do more research on it myself.
Well, and I mean, that's also is one saved through belief, through baptism, or through works? But, like, I think that one of the reasons why Christians are so obsessed with Jesus and with Jesus's, like, resurrection and all that is because that's one of the few images that they're allowed to latch onto.
Yeah, and that's right, Chris. We do. That's that's more what I mean. We do know about the Nokasuchi library, and that's why I said it's hard to like. There was no central doctrine for the Gnostics either, so that's the other part of it. But we do know quite a bit about them.
So, coming down, Mark Salazar says, for me, it was how the Christians take the Bible literally and how we're separate from creation and from God. It didn't make sense. Plus, their view of mysticism is demonic. So,
yeah, I don't get the whole. I never got that whole separation part either. Like, what, God created the earth and then just let it run, or why, or he didn't make it out of. It just didn't make sense to me. In short.
Thomas, Via, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, there was a lot of struggling for me as a Christian trying to figure out how exactly the creation would have worked, because in some sense, like, what we know about philosophy and general science, along with theoretical physics, we essentially don't have free will, and that was a major struggling point for me with how God created the universe, because it felt to me like he created it to run in a specific way rather than being involved in it. But there was also that contradiction both in the Bible and church doctrine, saying that he's always present and helping humanity along, and that we also have free will.
Yeah, I mean, the free will versus omniscience thing and the contradictions in the Bible where Yahweh appears to be surprised, or where Yahweh will issue a prophecy and like hold on to that prophecy, and that shows up in the Bible, and then later that prophecy doesn't come to be because he changes his mind, I guess, like trying to, even with open theism. Huh?
I said, or it's because Kamash gets in the way.
Or because he loses to Kamosh. But I mean,
hey guys. So Chris would like to come on.
Sure, Calon. Do you want to send him the invite link? I think it's in the group chat.
All right.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I would like to just say that I sort of had the reverse problem where when I started to get into polytheism, I tried to look at each of the myths that I was reading at the time, like the Iliad or the Odyssey and Theogony by Hesiod, as literal interpretations of what happened, and that got into weirdness pretty quickly, and I still don't really know what in the myths I should take metaphorically or just as part of an author's choice of words.
Yeah, I think that not being a mythic literalist leaves a lot more to the practitioner to kind of decide what they believe. And I think that that's actually a positive thing.
Very much so.
I mean, it's less comforting than the certainty presented by Christianity, but the certainty and absolutism presented by Christianity also is itself distancing, I think.
And it takes a lot away from the individual's freedom to practice how they want.
Yes. So, Rilia actually did share her story if she's comfortable with me reading it in the chat here. Rilia, I know that there's a delay, but do you give me permission really quick to read your post that you had here in the chat? Oh, hey, welcome. Welcome, Chris.
Hey.
Hello.
Let me try to move that up a little bit so you can actually see you better. There you go.
Oh,
hey,
and Chris?
I can turn off my camera now.
Yep, that means you can turn it off, Via. That means your mic might stop screwing up so bad. Okay, Rilia gave me permission really quick to read her experience in the chat. So she says, as a budding polytheist, or as a budding solitary, I was working off of these books telling me I was supposed to be a direct priestess to my chosen deity when my experience with religious leaders was seminary, which I obviously had not been to at 18, so there was a huge mental block there of, I'm not learned enough to do this. I'm not holy enough, etc. Yeah, I felt that early on when I was a Wiccan as well. Like, who am I to talk directly to deity? And I really, I struggled with that. I still sometimes struggle with that to a certain extent. Like, there are times when I come into ritual and I feel like I have to be more bombastic or loud or forward than, otherwise would be, because, there's that feeling of I need to be good enough. Chris, Thomas, Via, Calon, have you guys ever had that feeling?
Definitely. Although I think that's more of a depression and anxiety thing than anything actually theologically.
Well, in lots
I
of
mean,
ways,
for me, the gods can't leave a choice.
That anxiety with regards to not being good enough for the gods.
For me, it's not been much of an issue. It was more so actually as a Christian, because of the whole conception of there having to be this intermediary type conception between Yahweh and man. So,
what Christian sect did you come out of, by the way, for anybody who's not familiar with you?
I primarily came out of Lutheran and Methodist circles.
Oh, gods.
Hey, Lutheran buddies.
Yeah, I was non-denominational evangelical, so there was a little bit less of that, but there was still this idea that even though you can talk directly to God through prayer, you're actually talking to Jesus. I don't know. Again, it's all confusing.
That the whole Trinity thing is a mess in its own right, but even with Judaism and with that, there's still this conception of there having to be an intermediary type way to directly communicate in a lot of fashions. Like people can directly commune with Yahweh, but it's not nearly as open as it is with Canaanite religion, which is what I'm a part of. There, the gods regularly interact with people.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, you see that in Greek mythology as well, that the gods regularly interact with people, up to and including sexual acts and things of that nature. And, again, Platonists disagree to a certain extent. I've actually met some Platonists that disagree with some of the folks in the circles that you run, Thomas, in terms of whether or not we can have a relationship with the gods. Like, the gods may be unmoved by us, but we still can build a relationship ourselves with them.
This is going to sound kind of nitpicky or just a semantics thing. Someone who I really appreciate, Clayton of HellenicFaith.com, he says it like, we don't have a relationship because a relationship implies a equal sort of, if you think of like a relationship between friends, the two friends are equal in the sense that they're both human, but it's but it was said that because the gods are the best or just the highest beings, we can't really have a relationship with them, but you could have a relation with them. Again, I don't know if that's just very nitpicky, but
It seems very semantic.
yeah.
Well, I mean, I
It's
can
very-
understand from that particular philosophical system why you would want to be that nitpicky, because Clayton is also a Clayton's one of the
Platonist.
people that would disagree with some parts of the way that certain organizations interpret Platonism.
Mhm.
But like would talk about relations being like our worship of them still draws us closer to them. But
Yeah.
Platonist doesn't deny that like humans can have individual experiences from the gods from my interactions with him.
Yeah, and there's some, and there's just a difference between if you mean sort of a late Platonist, or as people often refer to it as Neoplatonist, versus sort of the more sort of direct of Plato.
Mhm.
That's a disagreement that can be, that's a distinction that may need to be made.
So, like, Chris, I remember you shared a bunch of stories about the church sort of shutting down independent thought when you were Christian. Like, you said that you eventually want to, like, get a degree in theology. I'm curious if you have any stories about, like, the way that the Bible or the way Christianity itself, given that you're kind of aspiring to become a, like, biblical history scholar at some point, like if you have any additional knowledge on that distancing in the Bible, how it evolves through the Bible, and like that the way that that could affect somebody, and the way it has affected you, given that you just came out polytheist recently.
Yeah, so it like if we go through the Bible as it's chronologically written, like not as it was, or like the internal timeline of it.
Mm-hmm.
God, Yahweh definitely has this tendency where he becomes more distant over time. Because he's very closely and directly interacting with the patriarchs. Like if we go back to the story of Adam and Eve, he's right there physically present with them interacting.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's physically in the garden too, walking around with them.
Right, and then later on he physically wrestles with Jacob.
Mm-hmm.
Thus giving Jacob the name Israel. Struggles with God. And my light's flickering. Then, but as he goes on and as time develops, and particularly as Israel becomes more difficult to work with in a monolatrous setting,
Mm-hmm.
he becomes more distant over time. He becomes, far more opposed to him being. Like he's not opposed to him being linguistically conceptualized and imagined, because throughout the Bible, no matter where you are, you're going to find him getting this really strong depictive imagery. Like he's described carrying a sword, described seated on a throne with wheels. He's described in other places with both
Walking in the
masculine and
garden.
lots of masculine and lots of feminine imagery, actually, especially birthing imagery.
Mm-hmm.
So it's but where he becomes more distant is his actual direct interactions with people. It comes to the point where he can mostly either interact with only his prophets, or basically
Hey, Calon, your mic.
Okay.
or to basically make a point. So, for example, one of the interactions he has in Second Kings, if I remember, is when he finally gets fed up with one of the Israelite kings and sends a lying spirit to deceive the king of Israel.
Well, there's also something very direct early on, also, where it said that we brought up the other night, he hardened Pharaoh's heart. Like, he very directly interacted with somebody who wasn't of the faith and, like, screwed with them.
Yeah, well, it's actually interesting that. So there's actually a passage in Ezekiel 14:14. If you look at the list of, they mention it's about basically how Jerusalem would fall under the, basically the punishment of Yahweh, and it mentions three figures: Daniel, Noah, and Job. All three of them are non-Israelites.
That's interesting. I didn't realize Job wasn't an Israelite.
No, yeah, he's at. Job is most commonly associated with throughout the book of Job, and possibly also in the book of Genesis, with Edom and northern Arabia.
Huh, that's interesting.
Yeah, and actually, Yahweh is strongly associated with those places as well. There's a non-biblical inscription. It's from Kentula Ejrud, which mentions Yahweh from Teman, which was Teman was a Edomite city.
Interesting.
So it's actually interesting that the people that are described as most righteous in Ezekiel and in other places tend to be non-Israelite figures, and he tends to have very direct relationships with them in those stories.
Well, he also, it's also that the
Daniel.
nation of Israel is often, like, described in philosophical terms as, like, being Yahweh's bride and, you know, being an unfaithful bride and things of that nature as well.
Yeah. Which goes to that goes to his masculine imagery, but then in Deuteronomy 32:6, it calls him the progenitor, or the one who brings forth. It's very common feminine imagery for describing how he brought forth Israel, as though he would in a procreative sense.
Mm-hmm.
So.
But then you get all the way to, like, you know, the New Testament, and you have Jesus, who, again, let's ignore the Trinity for a second, and let's say we're all polytheists here. Jesus is another God. I'm sorry for the Christians that are trying to reconcile their image of the Trinity, but, like, as polytheists, we can all probably agree Son of God means a separate God, generally, in our traditions. Jesus...
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
At this point, you don't actually even see Jesus interact directly with God. You see him call out to his Father on the cross, and you see him have his faith when he's tested by Satan in another of the Gospels. But you don't actually see him directly interacting with God. He is simply saying that he is the messenger and that he is the Son of God. And so you're meant, if you believe in the Trinity, to say, okay, well, this is God directly acting on the earth, but also he's supposed to have given some sort of sacrifice, and, like, we can get into the ridiculousness of how an infinite being could possibly have, like, a drop in the bucket be any sort of sacrifice if the Trinity is true.
Yeah.
Basically, in a metaphorical sense, Yahweh left Jesus to get a pack of cigarettes a while ago.
Basically.
Well, I am going to disagree a little bit, because while it's not explicit with how Yahweh interacts with Jesus, the language that it uses seems to be very important in actually saying that Yahweh does interact with him directly on a number of occasions.
There's a lot of verses where Jesus is talking about getting direct instructions from his Father.
But the point is that it doesn't say God did this at any point, where you see that in the Old Testament.
Right. Well, yeah. Correct, but we're also talking about two very different time periods of writing, and two different genres of writing as well.
Well, and that makes sense, but I mean, if you're looking at the Bible the way that it's organized, the way that a Christian would interact with it, which is kind of what we're talking about, distancing in the religion, right? Mm-hmm. Like, not every Christian's going to be a biblical scholar that's going to be like, oh, well, this is Greek, and this is, like, radically different etymology than, like, the way that things are being described in Hebrew. like, you're still getting this effect where as you go through the Old Testament, God goes from walking in the garden and directly interacting with things and being disappointed and surprised to being primarily like interacting with large historical figures to primarily only interacting with the nation as a concept to not directly interacting with any but one person and then withdrawing himself entirely, because when you finally get to Paul's letters, Paul has the vision of Jesus in the desert, but never at any point after that really mentions directly interacting with God.
Right. Well, but there still are actually cases where God does directly interact with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
For
The miracles.
well, the miracles can be interpreted as an instance of that, but directly and explicitly is at Jesus's baptism, where God speaks out of the heavens to Jesus and says, "You are my son; today I have begotten you."
Mm-hmm. Well, and that makes sense. And by the way, a comment from the chat: Mormons just say they're separate beings. It's one of the few things they're consistent on. So like Ocean talks about, like the various Christian sects as being like games. Mormons have an expansion pack that happens to retcon a lot of things and make them make more sense. So, like in terms of theological consistency, Mormonism is very interesting.
Yeah, it I've not delved too much into Mormonism yet, but that's a whole nother theological
It's its own bag of chips.
Yeah.
We need to get Chris. We need you to meet Tria, the ex-Mormon.
I know virtually nothing about Mormonism, so
Yeah, you'd probably find it really interesting. What little I've learned about it has confused me more than anything. I had a good friend growing up who was Mormon, and she talked about, like, becoming a servant to another god because her husband would one day become one, and all kinds of things, and what her rules were as a wife, and how she was to give birth to a world. It was interesting.
yeah.
So coming back to distancing, like when you were a Christian, did you feel that distance? Like especially being as deep into as questioning as you said you were in the last stream. Which we do have a link to the last stream in the description, or we will as soon as I fix the video, because we had it in the scheduled stream, and then YouTube decided to get into a fight with OBS, and OBS lost. So this one we're gonna have to move all of the descriptions. We'll fix the description at the end. But like, do you want to share any of those experiences, not just of being shut down for questioning, but like also feeling that distance? Because you shared some of that stuff with me in private, and if you're comfortable, I'd love to hear some more of it.
Yeah, like there was definitely when I was a Christian this feeling of a disconnect that I had with Yahweh. Like looking back on it, I think there are definitely occasions where I could say that he did interact, but his interaction seems very specific, very methodical. He's not a very just open deity at all. And he definitely is very reserved, and especially towards those I feel that are extremely challenging. People and beliefs I think that challenge him a lot I tend to end up being distanced from. At least that's what it really seemed like. Because when I was really devout and I wasn't questioning a lot of stuff, and like I was a young Earth creationist and a bunch of other things, he wasn't that distant as compared to how it ended up toward like earlier in my life, and then at the end of my tenure as a Christian. Both those periods during the heavy questioning, he was very distant. So
He doesn't like it when you ask
yeah,
questions.
and I think that there's also a large part of it, especially also for the polytheists who have had experiences with him and that feeling of distance. I think a lot of that also comes to the fact that he seems to have had a lot of tussles with other gods, like explicitly. Deuteronomy 32 is practically all about how he has a deep-seated thing for other gods, and combining Deuteronomy 32, Psalm 82, and Psalm 47, one gets the impression that he may have actually attempted like some kind of usurping of the gods in Israel, of the others, which ultimately it looked he was kind of successful in to a degree.
Well, and frequently when military battles were achieved in the Bible, like it was referred to as Yahweh, like destroying the other gods. And in the Exodus, it also refers to Yahweh, like getting revenge. In one passage, Yahweh getting revenge on the Egyptian gods for something.
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah.
Or
He
punishing
literally
them.
in Exodus before the plagues, he literally states that he will bring judgment on the gods of Egypt. It, and I mean that.
Sorry, Christians who aren't polytheists. Who
Well,
wanna
yeah, the
claim
Bible
monotheism.
the Bible explicitly acknowledges the existence of other gods. Like, a lot of people don't like acknowledging that, but they do.
Yeah, it's actually funny that my Jewish friends are far more open to that. One of my friends, who's an Orthodox Jew, is also a polytheist. He openly
I
admits it.
actually know quite a few Jewish people who have syncretized like lots of different forms of polytheism in with their traditional Jewish practice.
Yeah, he hasn't syncretized any of the traditions of the of other religions, but he openly admits that the other gods exist. Like I've talked with him a lot, and he's like, yeah, I've openly said that ocean's gods all exist. I just don't worship them. He's an exclusive monolatrist person.
Well, yeah, and I mean, that's kind of how pagans tend to view most other gods. Like, a lot of us have a lot of antipathy towards Yahweh because of what the Bible has said about him being the only God, at least the New Testament, and the way that a lot of modern day Christians like to deny the existence of our gods, somehow using it. But I think there's also something to be said for the fact that most polytheists and most atheists have actually read more of the Bible and understand these things more thoroughly than a lot of the Christians who show up at their churches, week after week and just listen to interpretations of it. Because, like, pastors tend to focus on stories that are either could be used as parables, or they tend to focus on passages that they can then talk extensively about application to one's life. The historical portions of the Bible, a lot of people have never even read them.
Yeah, most of them have probably never made it through Joshua, Judges, First and Second Samuel, and First and Second Kings, and most that I've talked to have never even attempted First and Second Chronicles.
Oh gods, hope you like names.
See, I actually like First and Second Chronicles, but no one else seems to.
Second Chronicles has a bit more story to it. First Chronicles is just like names, and then one sentence about one particular person and how awesome they were, and then names.
Yeah, I mean, the name of the book kind of, tells us exactly what it's going to be, though. It didn't.
Yeah, I mean, it literally chronicles the names of a bunch of different people.
Yeah, but
That's what I love about the ancients.
I felt similarly when I was reading the Iliad, just listing off so many of those names, and it was just getting through all of that was a chore.
The Iliad is so difficult to get through.
Yeah.
So
fun fact, we in Sumerian, we get to do that with entire passages because they repeat everything that they say.
Yep.
Like if I say, John, go get water, go ask Bill for water, John will go over and say, X asks me to go and get water for them, and so forth, and Bill will say, okay, I got the water which you requested to give to X or something like that.
Yeah, it's a very common poetic motif, especially in ancient Near Eastern poetry. They do the same thing in the Baal cycle. They'll have, for example, Baal will give Anat a message to relay to El or whoever, and then Anat will just state that verbatim to the person that they're wanting that said to. There's a lot of that copying, and it's a type of parallelism, mostly meant to just enumerate those points.
And emphasis, and it also helps for oral tradition as well.
Right. Yeah. It makes it very useful for oral tradition.
Could it also be in terms of sort of making a song out of these? Because I'm wondering if the repetition makes it sort of a verse, chorus kind of idea, sort of
Yeah,
structure.
a good number of them were probably set to music. Like most of the psalms, I'm willing to say were probably set to music, and there's a good number of hymns. Actually, um, the earliest musical piece that has actual music notation comes from a Canaanite site. Actually, it's from Ugarit,
Hmm.
and it's
Oh
pretty.
yeah, who got
Yeah.
it?
So,
Um,
coming back to kind of talking about the Bibles and all of that, my question to you, Chris, is: do you think that we talked earlier about the way that like the Bible constantly tells people you're dirty, God hates you, you know, like original sin, stuff like that. But then it also, in the same breath, God is a loving God, God is a jealous God, God wants a relationship with you. You can only have a relationship with Him through Jesus. You can only gain salvation through Jesus or through works we're not really sure. Do you see how that could have an effect on somebody trying to build a relationship with God? Or do you even think that, according to the literature, that's even possible? For a Christian, I mean, not necessarily on the Jewish side.
for a Christian, I'm very doubtful as to how much of a relationship you can actually have with Yahweh. I think Jews can have one much more than a Christian can, because Christians are so insistent on holding to views of God as being benevolent and a bunch of other just unsupportable ideas that they don't even end up. I My honest opinion is that they don't really even end up worshiping Yahweh
I don't think so either.
in a realistic fashion, because they more just decided to worship their idealized version of Yahweh rather than the one that has been clearly presented. Like uh, uh, they'll constantly try and make an excuse for him to be benevolent, even when in Isaiah 45 it clearly states, "I am the God that creates light and creates darkness. I create good and I create evil. I am the Lord that does all of those things." I mean, it clearly states that he is not a benevolent deity, but so I don't think that Christians really have a lot of times really have a very close relationship with him, because they're not even really wanting to worship him. They're wanting to worship something that something that comforts them rather than something that that's actually attested.
Yeah, really, from the chat says some like Old Testament Yahweh as long as he is Old Testament for people they don't like.
Yeah.
So my question, another question that I have, since we're on the topic of biblical history, what is your view on the Jesus' statement? I am not here to abolish the old laws, but to fulfill them. Sort of like this idea that the old laws are still applicable, but like sacrifices ended, and then later the insistence by Paul that certain parts of the old laws can't be applicable anymore to the new church. Like, is that extra theological? Is that decisions that were made in the church, or is that like does that have a literature basis?
I think that more just fits. Well, uh, okay. I do think that it is something that was probably designed to very much fit the church, but I do think that there possibly was at least a exegetical basis for it, because it's probably built on very loose interpretations of messianism, which is the gospels anyways. The gospels are all just consistently very loose interpretations of what it meant to be a messiah. And
Exegesis. This is how you get denominations.
yep.
For those in the chat who
So
aren't familiar, exegesis is the interpretation of spiritual text.
right, it's usually exegesis is what we do when we are trying to perceive what the text originally meant, and then eisegesis is when we try to put our meaning into the text. I think, and so actually I should correct myself, as I don't think it was probably an exegetical argument bit. I think it was probably eisegetical. I think that
So
they had their own idea of what it meant to be a messiah, and what the impact of the Messiah would be on the old law, and then applied that where they could to the Old Testament. And it's kind of like there's a similar method of doing this kind of reading was done in the Dead Sea, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls called Pesherim.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do we have any final comments? I think we're getting
I wonder
into
which
2
God
hours and
answers Christian prayers.
I mean, it could be Yahweh, it could be Jesus. We don't really know. I mean, technically,
I remember Ocean was jokingly said a while ago that who knows, maybe it was maybe Yahweh is Loki.
so
Yeah.
as a potential topic for a future thing, is Satan a deity? That would be a really
Yes,
interesting
yes,
discussion.
he is.
Yes.
All right.
I've never met him. I hear he's independent.
Yeah,
Is that true?
he belongs to the Christians, so they can have them. They can have him. He's a Christian deity, is my opinion.
The way that I've understood it is that there are multiple different Satans, and that Satan is just a title for an adversary of God. And so some of those Satans are independent gods, and others could be like lesser demons or angels or something along those lines.
That's interesting that you bring that up because I remember when I read Job, the word Satan was not used in the translation I was reading, which by the way was the JPS Tanakh,
Yeah,
and Satan in quotes was just referred to as the adversary in that.
yes. So the Satan, Hashatan in Hebrew.
Hashatan.
So there's actually debate over how it was supposed to be originally pronounced, especially in the Book of Job. Tur Sinai has argued that there was probably that they probably could have pronounced it either way, and it would not have changed its meaning originally, especially because in northern Arabia / Edom, where the book possibly originated, there wasn't that much of a distinction. But so basically, the idea of the job title is accurate. It's not a proper name. There's only one time in all of the Old Testament where Satan is used as a proper name, and it is in, I believe, Second Chronicles, if I recall correctly. It's in either First or Second Chronicles. I can't remember which off the top of my head.
Huh.
But everywhere else it's used as either a nominal phrase, just meant as an opponent or to oppose something, or it's meant as a job title of a specific being. The 2 times that it occurs as a specific being, actually 3 times, is there's one in the Book of Numbers where it's used to talk about an angel that came to act as a Satan between Balaam and the road he was traveling in Book of Numbers. And then the other 2 times there is Hasatan, which is in Zechariah 3 and then in the Book of Job chapters 1 through 2. In both of those times, though, Hasatan is not an opponent of God. He's actually a servant of God. His job is as a servant of Yahweh is to basically find and weed out those who are not faithful to Yahweh and then test them and persecute them for that. We get that in the Divine Council scene in Zechariah 3, where Joshua is brought before in this case is Joshua, who is the first priest of the Second Temple, and he's being used metaphorically there to represent Israel. So basically, Israel itself as a whole is put on trial before Yahweh, who is seated in a throne, and the Satan is there to persecute Israel for all the crimes and unfaithfulness that it has done. That's represented by Joshua being dredged in these terrible rags for clothing. And then Yahweh rebukes Hasatan and then forgives Joshua, giving them new garments. They've been made clean.
So Rilia, by the way, from the chat mentions, my dad knows a Luciferian church that's more uptight than most Pentecostals that views Lucifer as a Prometheus figure.
Wow.
That I thought you might get a kick out of that.
I guess if you're taking, I guess Paradise Lost as biblical.
Yeah, Paradise Lost is the best biblical fanfic ever. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's right there. Yeah. It's right there with the Divine Comedy on the Senpai Notice Me.
Yeah.
Lucifer is the first edgelord bad boy.
I guess.
Anyway, Chris, you're actually where I got my current theological position on Satan being a title from. I think it was something that you mentioned in that stream that you did with RN about where you talked a lot about the history of the Bible and different gods and stuff being mentioned in the Bible.
Wow, I'm glad I managed to reach anyone.
It's interesting.
I think that's how much sway you actually have in these communities.
It's interesting that Satan is a title. The only other thing that I've seen that comes close to something like that is Edward Butler has made this argument that the demiurge, with regards to Plato's Timaeus, is basically sort of similar as a job title, and that it doesn't necessarily describe a singular deity who forms the universe, but any deity could fulfill that sort of demiurgic role.
Yeah, and I somewhat agree with him on his position. I've read one of the essays that he put forward on it.
Yeah, I don't think that that Hashatan is meant to be like a thing that anyone specifically could take.
Do you think it's like a classification of a particular set of people on his council?
Yeah, that's more what I think it should be taken as, especially because, so if we look at Psalm 82, we have a different divine council scene, but the persecutor there is not Hasatan that we know from Job and from Zechariah 3. Instead, it is Yahweh himself. Yahweh stands in the midst of the council of El. El is actually the high god in Psalm 82. Seated and
some Canaanite stuff.
Well, it's not Canaanite, it's early Israelite. There is a little bit.
I mean, it kind of don't they overlap a little bit? The Israelites.
Yeah, they overlap a bit, but there is by the time that the Hebrew literature we have is coming about, there is an archaeological and self-identity to the area that is ethnically distinct from the Canaanites.
Apologies if anybody in the chat can hear my cat purring. She has decided that she's going to take over this space because cat.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
I think we should be getting pretty close to wrapping up, though, I think, because our viewership has gone down a bit, and we are almost at 2.5 hours.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I'm going to have to go soon to eat anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, so, just to sum up, though, with Psalm 82, the one that's the persecutor there is Yahweh.
He is Hashatan.
He is the Shatan in Psalm 82. And it's funny because Michael Heiser actually tried arguing that Yahweh is the high god in Psalm 82. And I showed that actually on the basis of his own dissertation work that's probably not the case because of the point that he is standing in the midst of the gods and the fact that he's also the persecutor. The persecutor is generally in these divine council scenes, especially in the Bible, is a lower divine being, not the highest one.
Yeah, so
Which
in that scene,
makes
at the
sense
very
for that
least.
area.
Yeah.
All right, so do we want to start wrapping up and do some final thoughts, and so we can actually have a bit of time to do the hangout afterwards?
Sure.
So for anybody
Fine.
who doesn't know, or anybody that's new who's still sticking around, I'm going to be updating the video description fairly shortly, but we do actually have a Poly-Ology Discord, and we usually head over there to do some after hangout chats. So if you guys want to all follow us there, then we can hang out and chat on the topic, or, you know, shoot the shit, or whatever.
You guys send me a link to the Poly-Ology Discord? I'm not on there yet.
Oh, I
Yeah.
thought you are.
I
No.
thought you were.
I don't think so.
Hmm.
I'm on
Okay, maybe you're
I'm on
visiting Calon's
Oceans
private
and I'm
Discord.
on yours, Calon.
Okay. I'll get you that link right now.
All right.
Also, I just want to say I appreciate the row of lobes on your bookshelf.
Oh yes, I
very much love the Lobe series so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah, I actually just recommended somebody pick up the Lobe on Stoicism, specifically for Epictetus, because I think it's one of the better translations.
Yes, maybe.
And if you don't like the translation, you can always learn Greek and translate it yourself.
Yeah.
That's the best way to go. That's like my way of going about things.
Yeah.
So, Chris, since you were the
But
last person to come in, do you want to do a, like, last thoughts and, or, like, channel plug, or just, like, say goodbye? Like, we didn't give you a chance to introduce yourself, because we all just, like, gushed about how awesome you are, so,
Yeah.
I mean, here's your chance to do that yourself.
Yeah. So I don't have many final thoughts, but basically, y'all can find me on Discord. I run a Discord specifically focusing on Hebrew Bible and ancient Near Eastern literature. It's literally called Ancient Near East and biblical discussion. And I can leave a invite link actually for everyone in the if it's okay with all you in the
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah,
Yeah,
looks fine.
sure.
Like, Calon needs to post a link to
okay.
the Discord in the chat, too, if any of our viewers want to come join us for the after-view hangout.
True, I probably shouldn't I?
Yeah, probably.
It's usually a good idea.
One final thought though, just because I saw it just here in the chat. Mark Salazar said the ancient Hebrews were Phoenicians back then. That I'm going to actually adamantly disagree. The Phoenicians and the Israelites ethnically were very distinct from each other and identified each other in very distinct means, especially.
Baal Hamon is different than Baal Hadad.
Well, Baal Haman was localized only to Carthage, actually.
Okay.
And the Carthaginian Phoenicians are even, I would argue, are also their own ethnic group in identity as well. But the Phoenicians, they had a very different deity set. They were far more syncretistic than the rest of Israel was. And also in the way that they would also, their language was distinct. They're all Canaanite languages, Hebrew and Phoenician, but they are different enough to be different languages entirely. And then also the way they depicted their gods, the way their art styles and their architecture are also all distinct from Israel's as well.
Phoenicia being also associated with the cities of Sidon and Tyre, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. Yep. Sidon and Tyre. Yeah.
Okay, so, Via, would you like to give your closing thoughts?
I had something, but no. If you come back to me later, I might remember it.
The turtle ate Via's brain. It's adorableness.
Yeah.
Thomas, do you have any closing thoughts?
Not particularly, except that I'm hungry and need to get dinner soon.
Yeah, that's probably why I couldn't remember my closing thought, because I'm starving. I've only had, like, a couple chili dogs today.
Calon?
Semitic polytheism is fun.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
All right. So I will. Calon, do you want to close things out? Like, thank you for coming by Poly-Ology. Da da da.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you for coming by Polyology. Please remember to like, share, subscribe, do all that nice stuff. Because it's nice to have more people, isn't it? I think it is.
Well, and
yeah, we will be doing a lot more content, and we're going to be picking up the pace a bit with this channel now. We had some difficulties that recently came about, but they have all been solved, and we are back to full production.
Yep, and we've got some great stuff coming down the pipeline. Like I said, we've got that Mythological Mondays video on Symposium and Soulmates. We've got a secret collab that we're going to be announcing more stuff on coming down the line. And we have some
that
additional...
will end Christendom.
And we will have some additional stream topics coming down the line. We've talked about Reconstructionism and book paralysis as being a potential topic for the future. Sort of, how do I know enough to worship my gods? And also, another discussion that we had going down the line was deconversion and our deconversion stories, as well as like the personal experiences we've had with our gods. So, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you all to the Poly-Ology crew for welcoming me as a co-host. I know that everything's been rough over the past couple of weeks, given everything that fell out, and I'm super grateful that that I was chosen to be able to fill in. So, thank you guys, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and if y'all want to, we're heading over to Discord to meet up and do an after-stream chat for a bit.